Thanks for tuning in, everyone. This is Chris from WCB Jazz Vinyl. So if you're here with me today, it's because maybe you saw my last video where I did a rundown of my hi-fi setup and you want the follow-up to that. Or maybe you missed it, in which case, no matter, I'm going to fill you in. So basically, I decided to replace my set of Paradigm Studio 100 V5 speakers because my listening space is simply too small for them. What I replace them with is a set that is completely on the other end of the spectrum in terms of look and sound, and let's be real, purpose as well. So what I want to cover today is how did I come to the conclusion that these speakers were wrong? How did I evaluate what to replace them with, and why I ended up buying a pair of KLH Model 5 speakers. If you've got a small room like me, you may want to stay tuned for this one. Now, some of you might be thinking, wow, he just discovered that big speakers aren't good for small rooms. Well, so not exactly. Worse than that, actually. I knew that they were wrong from the get-go. The situation was that a friend of mine was offloading his pair of Paradigms. I was still using my KEF LS50s up until that point, and I heard these Paradigms in my buddy's house, and I knew that they sounded great, and he offered them for a great price, and I figured that, yes, they're not great for my room, they're very large, and I was worried about that, but I thought that I would just make them work. Now, I know that this kind of thing is probably going to sound familiar to some of you because I think many of us have been there before. You get excited about something, in this case a set of speakers, maybe a component because it sounds great elsewhere, somewhere other than your place, and you think, yes, I want this in my listening room. I want to use this and have that sound, right? And you realize at some point that you failed to understand how the rest of your setup or maybe your room would completely change how it sounds. So in my case, how much of an issue could the wrong pair of speakers sound? Like, what does that even mean? Because it sounds, it kind of sounds like something that only audiophiles would care about, right? Like, oh no, the stereo imaging is off, like the vocals are off center by a couple of degrees or something. So in this case, it was impacting most of the music that I listened to in a noticeable way. So let's first take a look at the Paradigms so you can kind of understand what we're talking about. So these overall are big speakers with big sound. They're 44 inches tall, they're 5-driver, 3-way floor standing speakers with a 1-inch dome tweeter, a 7-inch mid-range, and 3 7-inch mineral-filled polypropylene cone woofers. The recommended power range on these is 15 to 350 watts with 91 decibel sensitivity rating and a 25 hertz low frequency extension. Now, these are indeed great speakers, or at least they have the ability to be great. So I thought I would look into what types of rooms these speakers work best in, like what are the ideal characteristics for the purpose of this video and to help explain why I made the wrong decision. And this is what I found about these Paradigm speakers. So these speakers want rooms with medium to large dimensions, with high headroom, with the ideal environment being medium-sized rooms with 2,500 to 3,000 cubic feet, or large-sized rooms that are 15 by 24 foot. They also want well-damped spaces with soft furnishings, drapes, and acoustic treatments. They like sufficient distance for driver integration, with a listening distance of 8 to 10 feet recommended. This is so how the two speakers can sort of integrate and perform at their best for you, the listener. So they further tell you with these speakers, you better avoid corner placement as it will bloat the bass and reduce detail. You should place them ideally 3 to 6 feet away from the rear wall to maintain mid-range clarity and prevent overemphasized muddy bass. So then, try and guess at just how well these speakers performed in my listening room. My listening room is essentially a bedroom-sized room. It's 11 by 15. So more specifically, let's see how it stacks up. So instead of 2,500 to 3,000 cubic feet, or a 15 by 24 foot room, as I said, I'm in an 11 by 15 foot room with an 8-foot ceiling, and that correlates to about 1,300 cubic feet. So I fall short on that one. So it referenced well-damped spaces. Well, I do have a rug, but it's on hardwood floors. I also have reflective windows in here. There's lots of pictures framed in hard materials like glass and wood. There's no drapes in here, and there's no, I'll call it, sort of engineered acoustic treatments for that purpose. So regarding the sufficient distance for driver integration, well, as you can see here, my couch has my ear placement 6.5 feet from the speakers, and there is no ability to move further away. So that's a no. To make matters worse, my speakers are about 10 inches from the wall because that's all I could give them, which is not even close to the 3 to 6 feet recommendation, and I can't bring them into the room, right, without sacrificing my listening distance. So these two things are kind of like working against each other. So then, and finally, like corner placement. I can't put them anywhere else. So I have one on the right that's backing up against record shelving, and the other is sort of near a corner, but also in the way of the room entrance. So even if I wanted to kind of bring them out and, I don't know, push them back or something, like it's blocking the entrance to the room. So I can't really give them any more space realistically. All right, so if you're keeping score, I get 0 out of 5 in terms of having the right type of room for these paradigms. And 0 out of 5 things that I could reasonably change without just simply getting different speakers. Maybe the acoustic treatments, but this is all on paper, right? This is all on paper saying that the paradigms don't sound good. Isn't it more important how they sound to me? Well, I confess that while there are aspects of these speakers that I can enjoy in my listening room, like sonic details, a big one, the problems that I'm having with muddy bass are pretty extreme. So the bass is not distinct, there's lack of clarity, separation, and overall definition in this room. Individual notes or like tones are hard to distinguish in terms of specifically the bass. And listen, I listen to a lot of jazz, acoustic jazz with an upright bass. There's slow decay on the notes, or essentially what that means is there's like long trails that impact the quality of the rest of the music. And in fact, I've come to the conclusion that my problems are actually more than that. I think that the music, even aside from the bass, isn't as enjoyable as it should be. I may have even found myself listening to vinyl less because some of these recordings just for some reason weren't exciting me as much. And that's not good, right? Because I like vinyl. I like jazz. I have a ton of records that I want to listen to again. And so this is the challenge, right? Can new speakers solve all my problems, right? That's the allure for many of us in this community, or certainly many audiophiles, is the what if, right? Like what's the weak link in my chain that if I replace is going to solve all my problems? Well, I don't necessarily have that expectation, but the bottom line is I actively don't like these paradigms, which the paradigms are objectively great, but they're just not good for my room. So one other quick note, because I feel like some of you may kind of notice this this possible solution, right? So before I get into how I solved it real quick, one thought could be that I rotate the speaker placement so that they're on the short wall of this room, which gives me more flexibility with the speaker placement, right? Because then essentially I have 15 feet to work with in terms of moving out the speakers and where I'm sitting. So the problem is I could only fit a very small and probably quite uncomfortable chair awkwardly placed where the closet door needs to open and where the entrance to the room is in order for that to work. So this would at least be better, and then maybe I wouldn't have to replace my speakers, but realistically there's too many problems with seating and sort of blocking even more of my record shelves with the speakers, which makes access difficult. So I wanted to point this out as a possibility because I did consider it. I even did some measurements, but it's also not a good solution for me. All right, so speaking of solution, let's talk about it. And I won't claim that I have the absolute perfect audio setup now that I have my new speakers, but I can confirm that the music sounds a lot better, a lot different. And I want to talk about both of those things. So what does a lot mean? First of all, oftentimes audiophiles, I feel like, will say that upgrades they make cause a huge night and day difference. Which sometimes you wonder, are they just trying to justify their purchase? Well, what I will say is even though probably my speakers need possibly some breaking in time, I've heard some people think that that's absurd. Maybe more likely my ears need some breaking in time in order to adjust to the new reality in this room in terms of how the music sounds. I will say that there is a very noticeable difference. Very noticeable difference. Music is the music, right? Like you're still going to hear the music that you expect to hear. But these KLHs solve for many of the problems that I was having in this room. All right, so I do want to talk to you about some of the recordings that I listened to so you can better understand exactly what I was hearing differently with these KLHs versus the paradigms. And so I am planning to do that, but first I want to talk about how I arrived at these particular speakers. So let's go back to the visual that I gave you in my last video. So I can't change my room size, right? So I need speakers that don't need a lot of space in terms of distance from the wall, because that was one of the problems that I had with paradigms and something that I can't realistically change. I just need speakers that are more capable of just dealing with that reality. So I need ones that don't require me to be so far away from them probably either. I really didn't think I could afford to give the speakers more than a foot or 12 inches from the back wall in terms of distance in order to maintain that 6.5 foot listening distance that I have with my couch. Generally speaking, if you find speakers that don't mind being so close to the back wall, they're probably not going to be ported speakers, and certainly not rear ported speakers like my KEF LS50s. So this was one of the first big requirements for me. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, what do I mean by rear ports or ported speakers even generally? Well, what these ports are essentially holes in the speaker. The purpose of them is to use the sound energy generated by the back of the speaker cone to reinforce low frequency output and increase the speaker's efficiency. They can actually reduce distortion because it limits the physical movement of the woofer. So one of the problems with some ported speakers, probably not all, but there is the possibility of getting air turbulence at high volumes listening to ported speakers. And so what manufacturers started to do is they located this port on the back of the speaker so that you don't hear it as much. Essentially, when they're on the back, they allow internal mid-frequency energy to escape out the back rather than bleeding through a front port, which can indeed help with mid-range clarity, and it can make the speaker sound more accurate. So there are lots of great reasons to have rear-ported speakers, especially compared to say front-ported. So I do think that rear-ported speakers can be great, but they need space further away from the wall because they can cause the bass to bounce back from the wall and become sort of overemphasized. So if you don't have the ability to pull your speakers out from the wall, you can either stuff your ports, which is kind of, I feel like, is taking capability away from your speakers, but maybe better yet, consider speakers that simply don't have rear ports. So the KEF LS50 speakers are an example of speakers that I've owned and used in this room in the past, but they are rear ported. Other examples of speakers that could go very well in my room, as far as I can tell, if not for these ports, are the very popular, and rightly so, Wharfedale Linton Heritage speakers. So in fact, they have dual rear firing ports. And though I've seen literature that says you can have them at least 8 inches from the wall, the optimal is said to be at least 2 to 3 feet from the wall. So I was a little conflicted here because these speakers get incredible reviews from many people interested in the same type of music as me and who have small rooms, but I truly can't pull my speakers out that much. Plus, the recommended listening distance for these speakers is 7 to 8 feet to ensure that the sound sums to what they call like a cohesive image. I mentioned this earlier, the speakers kind of working together. So this is the problem with these speakers, and I know a lot of people love them. So I mentioned some of the stats just now. Don't do math too carefully because you'll be quick to say, wait a second, like 2 feet plus 7 feet is only 9, and you said you have 11 feet on the short wall, but remember, you need like 2 feet for the speakers to sit on, plus my head is not like right back up against the wall because that's not good either, because you don't want like rear reflection issues. And all of that is just to say that you're getting the minimum distance addressed, plus the fact that the left speaker would still be blocking the entrance to my room if I pulled it out that much. Now, the Wharfedale Super Linton speakers actually are a bit more forgiving for small rooms, and I've heard great things about them as well. They only need 18 inches from the back wall, so I could probably work with that, with a minimum listening distance of 6 feet, but ideally you want 7 to 10 feet with these, and they too have the same dual rear firing ports. So am I discounting great options simply because they have ports? Does it seem like, I hope it doesn't seem like that's the only thing I'm considering, but maybe I am discounting them a little bit because I've had issues with some of these rear ported speakers. To the extent that I've owned many of them, not really, but the speakers that I have owned that have had rear ports have been an issue in terms of bass, so I'm a little bit leery of that. So to reassure you that my only consideration was not ports, and this whole video isn't just about dissing those. Let's move on to some of the other considerations. So another big one besides just my room layout is another important one, and that is something that matches my other components. Which I think also sort of answers the question of what goes well with the genre of music that I listen to. I feel like these are very much related. So I'm not going to rehash this in terms of all of my components in as much detail because I did that in my last video, but know that I have a Macintosh 2105 amplifier, a Macintosh C26 preamp, a EAT or European Audio Team E-Glow Petite Phono Stage, a Luxman PD151 Mark II turntable, and I use Hana carts, including a mono as well as a stereo one. So how does one think about pairing speakers with equipment? That's a really big question in more than just this video, but like in terms of generally speaking, so I'm going to speak from the context of like me in this situation and how it helped me determine what speakers to buy. So in my mind, along with my room, the most important factor in a setup that the speakers need to be a good fit for is the amplifier. There are some practical considerations, like can your amplifier supply enough power to your speakers? And can your amplifier safely handle that speaker without overheating? So this in some ways gets to the sensitivity rating, or what people sometimes call efficiency, where low sensitivity speakers require a higher power amp, while high sensitivity speakers or high sensitivity rating requires less power. So as it turns out, the KEF LS50s, the speakers that I had before the Paradigms, are very much in the low end in terms of efficiency with an 85 decibel sensitivity rating. The Paradigms that I just replaced are 91 decibel, which I feel like that's sort of in the middle in terms of what you're going to find out there from a variety of speakers. Otherwise, in terms of sensitivity, like high sensitivity speakers would include things like the KLH Heritage series, Omega speaker systems are high. In others, I'd say that are typically horn-loaded tweeters, large woofers, or even just large cabinet sizes are oftentimes going to have that. So practically, or maybe generally, what does that mean? Well, if you have a tube amplifier, you're going to want to have speakers that are on the higher range of efficiency. So don't be pairing like a low wattage tube amplifier that looks great with KEF LS50 speakers. You're going to have to turn the thing all the way up and still maybe not have enough power, sufficient power to drive them without some way of boosting it. Beyond power, you usually want to balance your amplifier in terms of the sonic characteristics rather than like doubling down on it, if that makes sense. So for example, if you have a bright sounding amplifier with bright speakers, so what does bright mean, right? Audiophiles say bright. So in this case, bright meaning emphasizing treble, usually more analytical speakers. It can sometimes cause, if you have overly bright speakers, it causes what a lot of people call listener fatigue, which means you just don't want to listen to them as much anymore because your ears like get tired of listening. At the same time, if you have a warm sounding amplifier and you pair it with warm sounding speakers, so warm in this case meaning rich or like smooth sound, what it can result in is the sound being sort of lifeless and muddy. So examples. So bright speakers are like the KLH Heritage line, the Bowers and Wilkins 800 speakers or Monitor Audio's line that uses metal tweeters. Warm speakers are often in the category that I think some people call like British design or BBC. So ones that fall into that category are the Wharfdale Linton bookshelves or the Spender Classic 2.3s. There's a vintage example that's very well regarded, the Acoustic Research AR3A, maybe to some extent the 2AX. A very general way of thinking about it relative to the music that you listen to, though, is that if you like vintage rock or even jazz, you may indeed like the warmer BBC style speakers. And generally, you're going to benefit from more analytical solid state equipment. And that's kind of controversial because I'm speaking very generally. Like people are going to like the qualities of the sound that they like, and they're going to like the equipment that they like. And sometimes we listen with our eyes, and if we see something that's very beautiful tube amp, we're going to want it to be better than maybe it is. So listen, like I'm a solid state guy, so like obviously I'm going to do talk a little bit of trash. I think tube equipment looks great. I get it. And there's tons of options of tube equipment that's actually great for jazz, but generally, in my opinion, tube is going to be a little bit better for orchestral music, acoustic music that's a little bit sort of quieter, more intimate, and then oddly enough, electronic music. I think it can work really well. So again, I think it's about pairing them right, and it isn't as simple as the categorization I described just now, but it's one of the ways to think about it in terms of how you test different options is to not necessarily go warm or bright, right? But kind of pairing the two, or choosing equipment that's a little bit more on the neutral side, and then choosing the side of the house in terms of speakers that you feel like is representing how you want to listen to music. So that's all kind of general stuff that you can either believe or not believe. But let me talk more about my situation. So back to my amplifier, I have a Macintosh, as I said, 2105 and a C26, so amplifier and preamp. So this is a solid state pair that works well actually with a variety of speaker types. So in my opinion, this Macintosh gear is pretty versatile, but maybe it's neutral to warm if you're going to say where it is on the spectrum. One category of speakers that it works very well with are sealed cabinet speakers, like the KLH Model Fives, like Acoustic Research AR3As, like ADS speakers. It also does quite well with Klipsch Heresy, Klipsch Cornwall, Altec Lansing speakers. And funnily enough, in my research, it turns out that they can actually be a great match for Paradigm studio speakers as well. But we've already discussed that there's some of these other issues at play that make some of the options that I've discussed, like the Paradigms, a bad fit in terms of the room size that I have, as well as the fact that they're so placement sensitive. So, what else should you consider in terms of equipment? Well, I've got this Luxman turntable, which, to the extent that a turntable does color the sound, I would say that I suppose a Luxman is known for a smooth mid-range, for tight bass, maybe slightly warm in presentation. I'm a little bit skeptical of these types of things when it comes to the turntable. Like I get speakers and I get like amplifier, and I certainly get the cartridge and how that can like impact, but like, come on, the turntable isn't just a motor that turns around. But anyway, humor me here. It's supposed to work well with the British designed speakers and acoustic suspension speakers, particularly, like many of the models that I actually just mentioned. Now, the HANA cartridges that I have, I would argue, have more to do with more to do with the sound than whatever the turntable offers, I would argue. I don't think that cartridges should dictate the speaker choice per se, but they certainly sort of tilt the overall system's voicing, I think, in a particular way that can either help the synergy with the speakers, or it can certainly hurt it as well. So my research says that some of the best speakers for the HANA SL cart, because it's actually different between the two carts. So some of the best speakers are the Harbeth C7 ES XDs, the Spendor Classic 2.3s, the Graham LS5 9s, the ATC SCM 19s. They all need to get some better branding. And then as far as the HANA mono cart, the ones that stand out are the KLH Model Fives, the Spendor Classic 1.2, the Falcon LS3.5A, and the Sonus Faber Lumina 3s. This is because all of what I just said is because, generally speaking, these carts want warm to neutral speakers, mid-range richness. They want smooth, non-fatiguing treble, and great imaging. And yes, those are characteristics that were provided by the manufacturer. So, because otherwise, I'm not a HANA cart. I don't know what I want. So, what can we learn, I suppose, about the mix of equipment and the room? I think it's that the best speaker characteristics for my room would be stand mount, or at least compact floor standing speakers, sealed cabinet speakers ideally, definitely not rear ported. I need to have excellent, what they call near field coherence. So the speakers need to be, sort of synchronous or have synergy as I sit closer to them. We already mentioned there's not a lot of space. And certainly the speakers themselves should be optimized as well for 6 to 8 foot listening distance. So in fact, the more that I research this, because we're getting more and more narrow, even though I'm not telling you what speakers I'm discounting as I go, I kept being led with my research more towards these British seal design types of speakers. So we're presuming price doesn't matter, right? Well, so let me talk you through what I had to compare after all of this research that I've summarized, I guess, up until this point. And this is kind of where price comes in. So the speakers that I was looking at in my short list, as I was going through kind of everything that I talked to you about, although I'm not summarizing all the research that I did, but I came up with a list of some vintage speakers because I love vintage. These amplifiers in here are vintage. I love the idea of vintage, but I also wanted a little bit of practicality and availability as well. And do I want to be redoing speakers, refoaming them and stuff? So definitely have some modern ones as well. So let me recap the vintage ones first. These are ones that met as many of my requirements as possible. Let me know in the comments what I missed. So where I landed was the Acoustic Research AR3As. I've already referenced a couple of times how well they fit my requirements, but also the Acoustic Research AR2AXs. These are both sealed cabinet. They do have very low sensitivity ratings. As far as I can tell, I think these speakers were available both in the late 60s and early 70s. They're pretty collectible actually because of how great a reputation that they still have. And maybe they were somewhat unusual in terms of their acoustic suspension design at that time, but I'm not entirely sure. I'm not as experienced knowing all of the speakers that were available and kind of what tech they were using. As far as finding these speakers, you can find them for $500. In fact, you could probably find them for $200 or $300 in really rough shape. If you want refurbished, you're probably refurbished done well with the right tweeters and stuff like that. You're talking a few $1,000s. And there's always going to be risk, right? Where would you find them? First of all, you have to go to a vintage audio shop, or what are you going to do? Buy them on eBay? It's actually a pair of, it's either 3As or 2AXs I saw on eBay, and I was trying to message the seller. But ended up going a different direction. So, okay, so those are the acoustic research. Do some research on those acoustic research speakers if you're interested and kind of have a similar setup as me, because maybe local to you on Facebook Marketplace or something, you're going to get lucky and find some. So the next set of speakers are the Advent Small and the Advent Large. Again, branding. So these came out in the early 1970s, I think. These are also acoustic suspension. They're not quite as efficient as modern speakers, with sensitivity hovering around the mid 80s for the small and upper 80s for the large. It's probably a little bit more efficient maybe than the AR3As. And then the third grouping that I wanted to bring up are Klipsch Heresy. So these are sealed, very popular. In fact, probably some of the most popular vintage speakers. They're versatile. Nicely restored ones can be expensive, but they're generally quite available. Just usually they're going to need some work. If you find them, the odds of who went through them and what did they do to them kind of thing. So usually they're going to end up needing to be redone anyway. But they're quite available, and they have a great reputation for a great reason. I've in fact had Klipsch Heresies in this room. I think there were Heresy 2s that I tried in this room, and inevitably didn't get enough improvement in terms of addressing some of the issues that I was expecting. This was a while ago though. All right, so those are the vintage ones that I looked at. I'm not going to boil the ocean and tell you all the ones, but those are the ones that I was really hoping to find, possibly expecting to find, somewhere used and maybe consider if they were nicely restored and such. All right, so the modern ones. I've got a little bit longer list here. So from low to high in terms of retail price, the JBL L52 Classic. These are about $1,100 new. They do have a front firing port, but not rear. They have a great reputation, and that's a pretty good price. I mean, that's even less expensive than the KF LS50s, and just a variety of speakers. That's a pretty economical choice. The next one, or really two, I suppose, the Wharfedale Linton Heritage. So I referenced this earlier. These ones come in at about $1,700. But again, with these the dual rear firing ports was one of the things that I was still nervous about, but I kept them in my consideration set because so many of you out there love them. And in fact, many people were actually doing YouTube comparisons of the Wharfedale Linton series with the KLH Model Fives, and so I kind of got into that comparison a little bit as well from all the content out there on YouTube. So beyond the Linton Heritage, there's the Wharfedale Super Lintons for $2,700. Then, again, in terms of escalating price, the KLH Model Fives, $3,300. Next is the ATC SCM19. These are acoustic suspension speakers for $3,500. The Harbeth C7 ESXDs, these retail for about $5,000. Next are the Graham LS59s, retail for about $6,000. And then finally, the Spender Classic 2-3 speakers for about $6,500. So, the speakers I went with, KLH Model 5s. I ended up removing some of those higher end ones simply due to price. I decided that I didn't want ported speakers, didn't want to mess with it, and I wanted sealed. I wanted the British design because of how conducive I've been hearing they are to jazz music, and because all my research suggested that they are a great fit for my overall setup, Macintosh gear, etc. Also, I will say that, I mentioned kind of being influenced a little bit about what's out there on YouTube. You kind of got to learn from your community as well. At the same time, you can't take everything at face value because, again, everybody has a different listening space. But there's all these other jazz heads that I talk to on Instagram around the country, across the world, that give the KLH Model 5s high praise. And these are people that many of them have small rooms, they have vintage setups. In fact, even some of the same Mac gear that I have. And so overall, very similar considerations to myself. And it's not like they were reaching out to me telling me buy these, buy these. I was kind of looking around on Instagram to see, hey, whose opinion do I respect and what are their speakers? So let me say about these KLHs, because I feel like it needs to be said here on YouTube. So I purchased these myself. I'm in no way representing KLH. I have no discount code to offer. I did not get a discount on these. But funnily enough, like a week after I bought them, they're on sale. So you can save $300 right now that I missed out on. But you can't win every time. And I have not been in contact with them. So I want to talk to you now, I guess, about my reaction after having set up these speakers, because again, I said this, there's a considerable difference between them and my paradigms. And I do mean that. And I understand that a lot of audio people say everything's considerable, like, oh, night and day. It's a big enough difference that I want to talk through this, because even though I'm still getting used to these speakers, every time I put a new record on, it's kind of like surprising in a different way. All right, so I want to talk about this within the context of a few specific albums, and you don't need to be familiar with these albums, although I'd encourage you to get familiar with them, because I don't know to what extent these are great, like official like test records. It's just I wanted to hear how the setup and how these speakers handle these particular records. So this first one probably comes as no surprise for those of you who follow a lot of my content. You know I love Chris Connor. This is He Loves Me Not. This was put out in 1956. It's an original mono pressing. So obviously I had my Hana mono cart that was set up. Wanted to have a couple of mono records to put on from a variety of different engineers. This one happens to be recorded by Tom Dowd, who did a lot of Atlantic work. Also have some Rudy Van Gelder to talk about. So I think that this is a great mono test record. Chris Connor is a vocalist. She's featured alongside a string group that does not have that string group dominant or overpowering and syrupy like you might get from later recordings. Instead, her voice sort of pops out through the instrumentals, and it's really clear and vibrant. And so I wanted to hear how this sounded. So what I would say, firstly, if I was going to pick out a song in terms of what, where it really I don't know, the difference in terms of the speakers spoke to me the most is the track Angel Eyes. It's a great feature for Chris Connor. Really highlights the sort of husky voice that she has. It's slightly smoky, gives you a really good sense of center as well in the room for the vocals. Another good thing about this record is you can find it for like $10. And again, that's for a 1956 original pressing. So what struck me about this is just how different her vocals, or generally vocals, sounded with these speakers. To me, it sounded like the vocals were like very much out front, like much closer to you than the speakers are, than the speakers in the room are, with the orchestra pushed to the back. So said a different way, I think what I mean is that it feels like there was distance or space between the vocalist and the instruments, and that is a quality of great speakers. And for those of us who listen to jazz, like to kind of hear that. You like to hear space around the instruments because it adds extra definition. And when I say that there was space, it really felt significant. Like, I have not heard her singing, or some of these others that I listen to, have there be that much distance between them. And I think that the KLH Model Fives can be a little bit treble heavy. But when you have some of these older vintage recordings that are mono, it seems to work really, really well, because they didn't record with a lot of bass. There wasn't a lot of like kind of denseness to bass notes in a lot of these old recordings. And so you're not having to kind of deal with that, I suppose. And so when there's a little bit higher treble with this sort of British design, sealed speakers or whatever, it feels like it accentuates it even more. So these early recordings are, I would say, overall the biggest surprise for me. And you all know that like most of the music in this room is vintage. Most of it's before 1970. So this is a really exciting learning for me. And what it did is it made me want to look out for, or try out, other recordings that were mono, that were recorded early, that could highlight not necessarily always vocals, but something. Like, I wanted to hear piano, I wanted to hear trumpet, and hear how it's treated relative to the rest of the band, especially as you get into small jazz combos that are very, very different than, I'll call it like a block sort of sound of an orchestra that happens to all be in the background. So anyway, this was one of the first albums that I pulled out, and again, noticeable difference between this and the Paradigms. All right, so you're gonna laugh at this next one because it's not jazz, and I just bought this. The album just came out. Pitchfork gave it a super high rating, and I previewed it, and I had to get it. And then just kind of coincidentally, I had the new speakers in, and I'm like, let's see how it sounds. So Aldous Harding, and it is called, not as familiar yet with it because again it just came in. Train on the Island is the name of this. Apologize if there's some glare from the shrink wrap. So again, Aldous Harding. Firstly, I had never heard of this artist until the album came out, but again, the review and previewing it, there was something that I was sort of captured by. This is another example where, even though it's not mono, stereo, vocalist very much in the center, a lot of distance. And I'll say partly it's because this is a very stark album in terms of the instrumentation, so sometimes it really is just her solo, but I was surprised at the clarity that it had. Now, I can't say I've listened to this in the Paradigms. Remember that, because I just got this and I'm listening to it on the KLHs, but it represented that same quality that I had on the Chris Connor that I was so impressed by, the clarity, like how much it felt like the voice was in room in terms of sound. It sounded a lot more natural than I feel like the Paradigms, where I don't know. I hesitate. I don't want to keep talking down the Paradigms. It's just such a different sound. And I maybe I just didn't know what I was missing, I suppose, with the going this direction with the KLHs. But this is another one, again, like I said, vocalist that I was completely blown away by, because of the, I don't know how to describe these things, like the immediacy of the vocalist and how like clear it was and how, again, in room it was. So even aside from that, maybe go preview this on Bandcamp, because it's if it's available there, because it's quite a good album. All right, so let's move over to another stereo record. So this is Empyrean Isles by Herbie Hancock. Not the original, even though I have an original. This is the Music Matters single disc, 33 RPM. So I wanted to bring this in because, as I mentioned, I was so impressed by vocals. I wanted to hear something else that was treble heavy and kind of hear how it was treated in a stereo format, especially with this, because the trumpet is in, I believe, the left channel, so it's not center. And I wanted to hear, in fact, there's a little bit of like, hard pan in this recording too. And so I wanted to hear how it sounded with a quote unquote audiophile pressing. And what I noticed with this, that never impressed me as much with other speakers that I've had in this room is how crisp the trumpet is. So in much of the same way that I've been so impressed with sort of treble heavy vocals, the trumpet, it just sounds so clear and amazing. Not hot, right? I'm not talking about the mastering of this, which I understand can be, this can be a hot recording, but instead that the trumpet sound is like crisp and bright. And so I guess let me just say the difference between when it's hot is that it can get distorted, and it's often more commonly used to describe something that was like, again, how it was mixed. Whereas crispness or brightness can be a product of how your speakers reproduce the sound, as far as I understand. So again, this sounds very different from the Paradigm. I could really hear the low frequency from the tom hits on this one. So one of the things that I haven't mentioned actually thus far is that I decided to, while I was listening to this, I decided to finally hook up my KEF LS, or excuse me, my KEF KC62 subwoofer. Because what I noticed when I was listening to this one is because it's hot, this is now talking about because it's hot, the tom hits on this one are a little extreme, and it also causes some like very low frequency bass thud. So what I decided to do, and this is a problem, or this is a situation anyway with this recording, is I routed, I plugged in my KC62, so the music goes from the preamp all to the KC62 that absorbs the very low frequency bass below the crossover, and then it sends the rest, it filters, or it's basically a doesn't filter, it just passes through all the rest of the music back to the amplifier. It's like one of a couple of ways of wiring a subwoofer. So anyway, I lowered the crossover just a little bit, and it actually worked out really, really well in terms of dialing that in for this recording. And I will say that ever since I did that, I kept the subwoofer plugged in, and I actually think that it's a really good pair with the KLH Model Fives. I don't think you need it, but I'm trying to dial in this room, and there was a lot of brightness from the speakers that I really loved. And to some degree, and without acoustic treatments in here, I was looking for a little bit more bass. I have the KC62 that I just haven't plugged in a while. Anyway, that's what I ended up doing. All right, so one of the things that they always say when you're auditioning equipment, and especially speakers, is to choose music that you're very familiar with, because how much audio memory do you really have in terms of like, oh, I listened to this album a long time ago and now I'm listening to it again and imagining all these differences, right? So one of the albums that I am the most familiar with is Pepper Adams Quintet on Mode, and the reason is because my own label put this out in October. Go check it out at gambit.com. And our next recording, or our next release, is coming up this summer. So I played this. I've listened to this so many times. In fact, to the extent that I probably shouldn't listen to it anymore, because I'm just so familiar with it and evaluating the test pressings and all of that kind of stuff in order to put it out. So what I would say about these speakers and their treatment of this album is that the mid-range was very, very different than what I'm used to with the Paradigms. It is a brighter sound, but it is also a warmer sound. I would call it less clinical on these speakers than the Paradigms. This is why this Pepper Adams Quintet did so well with audiophiles. And I think that like I played it on my Paradigms, and I was just really dialed into all that kind of like sonic detail, and I couldn't even believe how much of that was there. You know, vintage recording, early stereo. I was blown away. And so when you have Michael Fremer give it great reviews, and Steve Westman and all of these respected people give it great reviews, and I know the how they're approaching it to some degree in terms of the types of equipment that they might be listening to it on. I get it that because I own the Paradigms, just how much sonic detail there is here. I would call the KLH Model 5s less detailed, less clinical than the Paradigms. However, I actually don't think that that's a bad thing. So I found myself paying attention less to the sonic detail and a little bit more to the cohesive nature of the sound. I think that the bass was much more distinct. I'm not saying louder, but more distinct than the Paradigms. It had a tendency to get really muddy in this room, as I mentioned. So I really enjoyed that. And what I would say overall is that I feel like the trade-off may be that the KLH Model 5s are less detailed than the Paradigms, but warmer sound, more cohesive, better bass. And I would say more pronounced in terms of the punchiness of some of the horns as well. All right, so I wanted to cover just one more, and that is a mono recording by Rudy Van Gelder. I know I covered Empyrean Isles, but that was stereo. That was like a modern audiophile pressing. I want to cover an original pressing, mono, piano, sort of classic piano trio format. And what I would say about this is probably many of the same things that I've already said, but I feel like as much as I'm impressed by these speakers with how they treat stereo, how they treat vocalists, I think that there's plenty of detail, even if they're not as clinical as the paradigms. It just sounds more natural to me, and I'm not paying attention to it. Where it kind of comes together, though, for me, is these types of recordings. So mono recordings, older recordings. If I was going to say which of them that the KLH Model 5 shine the most, it's the mono, and it's older. So I couldn't be more happy with that outcome because of how many mono recordings I have in here and how many of my records are original pressings. I mean, it's, you know, something like 90+%, right? Of all 4,000 records that I have are original pressings, because that's just what I prioritized. So many of the things that I was impressed by thus far with the KLH is again present here. The piano sounds absolutely fantastic. The bass, I would say a tad rigid, but improved with the KC62 subwoofer. And again, we'll see if there's anything that happens as the woofer sort of relaxes or settles in, to the extent that you guys believe in that. So we'll see how that kind of changes. But let's be real, like, you know, the bass was never that resonant on a lot of these early recordings anyway. And so I think what I need to do is simply play the field a little bit more in terms of all the music that I've listened to on these speakers over a period of time, to get a little bit call it crisper sense of exactly where these speakers fit on things like bass, right? Like, is it sufficient or is it not? Is it a product of the recording? Is it, you know, all that kind of stuff. But again, I felt like piano trio, these speakers knock it out of the park. You know, as soon as I play something like this, I want to grab all the other piano trio music, certainly the Bill Evans and everything like that. But these speakers are so new that these albums that I'm covering are almost the only albums I've listened to. And I wanted to make this video anyway, because I think that sometimes your first impressions are the ones that are like sort of the clearest, your initial instinct before my ears get used to what these sound like and I forget, right, what the paradigms sound like. So I don't know. I mean, maybe that's all I wanted to say about this, but what was just really exciting to me is that if music like this is impressive with these speakers, then I know that I've made a good decision. So I think I've covered it all. In a little bit of what was probably a marathon discussion, but I wanted to talk about this topic, this idea of new speakers, small room considerations. Everybody's situation is different, but hopefully for those of you who are maybe skeptical of whether your setup is right, hopefully there was something in here that helped you, I don't know, better understand, or at least understand some of the considerations, some of the speakers that I was considering for this room. And again, are the KLH Model 5s the absolute best? Probably not. It's probably some other speakers that were more expensive that I could have gotten. But I'm not in any way disappointed with my decision. And I think that's the most important thing, right? Like, if I'd spent all this money, done all this research, and I didn't have any improvement, that would be a problem. But I think what I am impressed by is that even though I wasn't able to sort of test drive, right, all of these different speakers that I was considering, to still come to a conclusion that I was so satisfied with, I think is encouraging, and I don't know, gives me confidence in my process. Even though if I'm not the most knowledgeable person out there, I don't review speakers for a living, right? Like, I don't know how so many of these sound. I haven't heard them. So, but I also think that's most of us, right? You take some of the feedback, or take some of the advice that you can get online from friends, from other audiophiles, from shops, obviously. But at the end of the day, you also kind of have to come to your own conclusions in your own room. So thanks everyone, for those of you who have stuck through this video with me. And I suppose I will see you next time.